Hello there, welcome to Penarth Archery Club's YouTube channel. My name is Jeremy. This is another video in the series Archery the Basics. I've already put together and published several videos in the series, one being in 3 parts, which is buying your first bow, and another entitled Assembling Your Arrows. This video follows on from the basic bow setup part 1 and will complete our look at the full basic setup process. This video series, Archery the Basics, is not meant to be expert or definitive on the various subjects, but just some ideas, advice and guidance in a central resource library to help our members. They then don't have to go online searching for this content and trying to decide what information to follow, as there is so much out there. Here in part 2, we can continue with the setup process. The next step would be looking to set the center shot of the bow. Here we are talking about when the arrow is attached to the string and sits on the arrow rest against the pressure button, and its alignment with the bowstring when seen from behind. So we need to set the bow up so that it is vertical, not sitting on the limb tips, but held in place, so that we can look at the bow from behind. Again, the bike clamp is useful as it gives a static setting that can be adjusted and held in place. You can even use some of the clip-on levels if you want to get things absolutely vertical. We need to have reference marks on each limb to show us the center of the limb and help us with alignment when we look at the string and bow alignment from behind. I attach some tape, measure each limb and mark the center of each on the tape so that the mark can be seen from behind the clamped bow. With a compound bow, you need to measure the distance from the outside of the limb to the string on the cam. As they are offset, we need to duplicate that offset position to mark that distance on the tape. What we're looking for is to knock an arrow onto the string, place it on the arrow rest. For a recurve bow, from directly behind the bow, we then need to judge where the arrow sits in terms of alignment with the bowstring. Ideally, we want to see the end of the arrow shaft sitting alongside and slightly to the left of the string. The string should then line up with the central marks on the top and bottom limbs and the center of the grip on the riser. Often we use the rear lock-in screws on the riser to help with this as well. This is for a right-handed archer. For a left-handed archer, the arrow would sit to the right of the string. This takes into account that right and left hand risers mirror each other and the different way the arrow flexes. Where there is no pressure button being used, there's usually some form of spur on the rest to move the arrow shaft away from the riser. If a pressure button is fitted, we use the pressure button to move the arrow in and out as required. Pressure buttons have a movable collar on the screw thread and usually a large nut on the end of the button to alter the spring pressure. We can unlock the collar on the button and rotate it to the depth we need. Once we are happy with the alignment, we can lock the collar. It seems daft that we are setting what is called the center shot of the bow, yet the end of the arrow shaft should be slightly to the side of the string, so the arrow wouldn't be pointing directly at the target. This is to take into account that when we release the string during the shot, the string moves both forward and sideways at the same time, our fingers being in the way of obtaining a perfect release of the string. With the mass of the arrow being attached to the string while it moves forward, this causes the arrow to flex inwards towards the riser at first. This is where the pressure button and having the correct spine arrow comes into play. In simple terms, the pressure button, which is a spring-loaded plunger, reacts against the sideways push of the arrow and pushes it back into alignment as it passes the riser. The arrow only touches the button for a very short time on release. This then aligns the arrow correctly, it stays on the string, and then as it detaches from the string and heads off towards the target. Things get a bit complicated when talking about arrow nodes and the like, but we are compensating for this sideways flexing when set in center shot and can refine the adjustments on the pressure button when we go on to do more involved bow tuning. This flexing and alignment of the arrow when shot is often referred to as the archer's paradox. A paradox being something that doesn't seem correct but actually is. The paradox is that the arrow is not aimed directly at the target but to the side, but still hits the target when shot. We need to make sure that when being shot, the arrow will clear the arrow rest, the pressure button and the riser. Don't forget we have fletchings on the end of the shaft to get by the riser. If we've used a stick-on arrow rest, we will have positioned it over the pressure button bushing. If we're using a mechanical flip rest, perhaps wrapped around the riser, then there may be some adjustment required. When an arrow is on the rest, the pressure button tip needs to be in line with the center of the arrow shaft, so adjust the arrow rest arm as necessary. When this process is completed, we should have the center shot of the bow sorted, and from behind the bow we should see the arrow sitting on the rest with the correct knock-in height, resting against the pressure button correctly, and aligned slightly to the side of the string. If using a sight, then that can be installed and the sight pin set roughly in line with the arrow, just to start. If we look at setting up an ILF recurve for bare bow shooting, most of the previous information is still pertinent. The tiller adjustment and setting would likely be for a neutral setting, as using 3 fingers under the arrow draws the limbs at a slightly different dynamic effect. So that is taken into account by using either a neutral tiller or a negative tiller. The static setup on a compound bow is quite different. With compound bows, the process does differ. We're unlikely at this level to start altering the brace height of a compound bow, but we run with the manufacturer's recommended height to which the bow is usually set. When considering the difference between recurve and compound shooting, there is very little horizontal flex in an arrow left to right when shot from a compound bow using a release aid. With recurve, the fingers influence the string as it moves forwards and sideways, as we can't get them out of the way that quickly. With a compound bow and release aid, there's very little interference with the string moving forward, as the release is almost instantaneous. The string does not waver as much as when shot with fingers, so the center shot setup on a compound is just that. The arrow is lined up centrally on the bowstring, so in line with the string, with us already having taken the offset of the cams into consideration when putting tape and marks on the limbs. With knock-in height, this is also different in that it is usually set horizontal. Any flexion of the arrow, when shot competently with a release aid, will be very slightly in the vertical direction, less often sideways. Compound bows have various types of rests or launchers that hold the arrow at full draw. They do not use a pressure button. The launchers are usually adjustable for vertical and horizontal adjustment, so we would be moving the arrow to directly line up with the taped marks on the limbs and the string, both vertically at the knock height and laterally to center the arrow. So the compound setup varies, but is commonly a horizontal knock-in height with the arrow centered, taking into account the cams rather than to the side of the string. If the rest launcher is in contact with the arrow, then clearance of the arrow must be considered. Often a blade of varying flexibility and width is used to support the arrow. This is somewhat like the effect of a pressure button, but in a vertical flex situation. There's no spring pressure that can be altered, just use a more stiff or weaker blade. So there is some effort needed to make sure that the blade that the arrow flexes against when the arrow bends is suitable for the arrow shaft deflection, also that the fletchings clear the blade in flight. If using a drop-away rest, as can be seen on these bows, providing it is set up correctly to raise at the last few inches of draw and drop away quickly on release, there should be no issues with clearance. These can be cable activated, where the launcher is tied to the downward moving cable, or limb activated, where they are attached to the bottom limb. The string attached to the launcher raises and lowers the arrow rest during the shot cycle. Most compounds being shot with the release aids have a D-loop tied to the bowstring. This sits top and bottom of the knock sets, and allows the release aid to be attached directly to the D-loop, not the actual bowstring, and so sit directly behind the arrow. The D-loop allows the release aid to be twisted, as is normal with handheld release aids, without interfering with the arrow on the bowstring. This aids the release of the string and reduces any interference with the string, so keeping the effect on the arrow to a minimum. I won't go into the method of putting a D-loop on a compound here. There are good videos to be found online showing the specific method to do this, so rather follow those than take up time here on this video. Provided the correct spine has been selected for the compound bow, getting good arrow flight is relatively straightforward. It is usually more a case of checking arrow clearance dependent on the arrow rest or launcher. Usually the compound bow will be fitted with a peep sight set into the bowstring, which is an aperture that acts as a rear sight in the sighting system of the bow. This needs to be set up so that at full draw, when the compound archer sets the bow into their reference position, they can see through the aperture of the peep sight. This is where a bow press may be needed to compress the bow limbs, to give some slack on the bowstring to enable a peep to be accurately inserted or moved between the threads of the string for alignment. Once the bow is released from the bow press, the bow can be drawn and the correct position of the peep sight checked. It is then usual to serve around the peep sight and string to secure it in place. I have only recently bought a compound bow press, so I'm definitely no expert at all in using one. I've been watching various YouTube videos on the process. They're an expensive bit of kit, so it may well be that a couple of compound archers get together to buy one, or perhaps you are lucky that you belong to an archery club that has one. They need to be treated with respect to ensure neither you or your bow get damaged when being used. This particular bow press I've bought also has a drawboard, which is a ratchet and pulley attachment which allows you to pull the bow to full draw when it is strapped onto the press. This gives you the opportunity to check the bow for various issues, such as the timing of a drop-away rest, the timing of the cams, altering peep height, etc. These are not the things that you would be doing as an inexperienced archer setting up a compound bow for the first time. You would definitely benefit from having an experienced compound archer and bow press user alongside you, or having this done at a bow shop. So with all the types of bows, this is effectively as far as we can go with setting them up without actually shooting any arrows. This is the static setup. Next we need to move on to do some basic bow tuning to complete the setup of the bow. This is something I'll look at in the next videos. So I hope these two videos will help archers understand their equipment a bit better and also give them some detail and insight about the mechanics of the bow and how the elements of the setup are needed to get the best performance out of the bow and arrow combination. As always, it would be appreciated if you found this video useful if you could hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. I'll be back soon with some videos on the basic bow tuning needed to complete the full setup of the bow. Thank you for watching.